Thank you. Thank you for that very nice welcome. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the conference organizers. I know it's a lot of work to put one of these on. And thank you to London for not raining on me for the first time in my life. So I'm here today to talk to you about designing and building products for a very different kind of digital landscape than a lot of us are used to. So let me start by asking you to think about the next billion people who might be using our products. Who will that be? Like, who are we talking about when we talk about the next billion? I think it's worth defining this. I mean, is it the next billion children that are being born, next billion babies on iPads? No, of course not. It is people in emerging economies. So the next billion refers to the next big wave of people that will get access to connected internet devices, computing devices. And we're not talking about unconnected people in developing economies, developed markets here, because in these developed markets, most people are already online. And not everyone, not everywhere, but mostly. So Europe, for example, overall is around 80% connected. Here in the UK, it's about 90%, and in some of the Nordic countries like Iceland and Norway, it's close to 100% of people are online. In the USA, it's around 75%. Australia, where I'm originally from, is around 85%. Canada, 88%. You get the idea. These, most of us are already online in these countries. So new internet users in hugely populous countries with big emerging economies, they're connecting from places like Sao Paulo, Lagos, Kinshasa, Nairobi, New Delhi. And the connectivity rates here are much lower in developed markets, of course. So there's way more potential for growth here. And I mean, when you think about it, like 1 billion new people joining the internet, it's kind of an amazing number. So in Mexico and Brazil, which are both very populous places, only around half of their populations are connected. In South Asia, maybe around a quarter. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's just scraping past 20%. And these are aggregates for regions as well. In a lot of individual countries like Somalia, you have as low as 1% of the population connected. So it's a huge amount of people who aren't online, who've never been online. They've never ordered food delivered to their house and tracked it in real time on their phone. They would find it even quite difficult to fill out an online form. They've never messaged people on Facebook. They've never used email. It's that kind of thing. But it's changing really, really fast because the cost of mobile data is coming down a lot, and the availability of really cheap handsets is increasing. So at a street market in Nigeria, you can buy a second-hand, cheap, Chinese-made knockoff of a BlackBerry or a Lenovo phone. You can take it home, charge it up on a car battery if you don't have working power. You can buy 300 megabytes of data for 500 naira, which is about £1. And this really opens up a whole new world for you in terms of knowledge and opportunity and communication. So the barrier to entry to the internet is getting much lower, but it's definitely still there. Because these millions of people who are now getting access to connected smartphones, so many of them can still only really access like a few megabytes of data here and then. That's all they can afford. They have these very low-cost, low-spec smartphones. They have very unreliable electricity sources to charge them. And a lot of them are learning how to use digital interfaces for the very first time in their life. So I'm here today to pose the question to you. What can we in the tech industry, in design, what can we do to keep lowering those barriers? So how can we fulfill this original egalitarian promise of the internet? So that someone like Mariama here, who lives in rural Guinea, who got a phone for the first time in her 40s, and now uses it to record details of malaria treatment and rates in her community, which replaces this big book here. So someone like Mariam and everyone else starting out on the internet for the first time can have a chance of access to the same kind of opportunities and services as somewhere like London. And of course, there are no hard and fast or easy answers to this. And I don't think it's a problem that the Western world should try and sweep in and solve. I don't think we have a very good track record on that front. But I want to give you a bit of a framework of understanding about the context and about the kind of conditions that you come across. And give you some really good principles to start from so we can do more to make the things that we're working on more accessible. So maybe at this point you're asking why me, an Australian-born person who lives in Germany, which are both very well-connected places, can give you any insight on this front. So that's a very good question. So my name is Ali Long. I'm Aliel on Twitter. Use it wisely. I'm a product designer and front-end developer, and I've worked on a lot of different kinds of things, small, medium, large websites, apps, for a lot of different kinds of clients. So everything from blogs and editorial, e-commerce, video and live streaming, analytics tools, and a lot of like shiny brand experiences at creative agencies like Eden Spiegelman. And at those places, we're constantly chasing innovation in the form of like new and shiny things and latest frameworks, really slick UIs and immersive user experiences. And I think we're understandably excited about the possibilities inherent in a world of really powerful handheld devices and super fast connections, and as well as a user base with like the know-how and the means to buy into whatever we're putting out there. But I have also worked with these NGOs and nonprofits, especially in the last few years, on software for public health and markets in West Africa. So this has involved partnering with various West African governments, with UNICEF, the World Health Organization, the Gates Foundation, Institute of Tropical Medicine, etc. And it involved tackling very complex and significant and oftentimes very urgent problems. So I've worked on programs for polio eradication, for vaccine delivery, for the Ebola response, African sleeping sickness, and so on. And I don't want to downplay the seriousness of those issues, but the array of technological challenges that we had to deal with when tackling those things, it was a really fascinating thing to sink your teeth into and really actually very innovative. So we were doing things like mapping unsurveyed areas, going out on kind of motorcycle gangs like this, dealing with very poor and often no connectivity, and having to do things like visualize epidemiological patterns like disease vectors and surveillance. We had to design mobile data collection tools for users who often were just starting out using them. And we had a lot of logistical challenges of just trying to get around, trying to get to like very remote and unconnected communities. And doing a lot of this at scale across various countries, so Sierra Leone, Nigeria, Guinea, DRC, and Liberia. And what I really learned is that there really exists another kind of digital landscape from what I was used to. And there are places where the conditions are very imperfect, the networks are very flawed, and technical literacy can be very low, and kilobytes can be very precious. So these carefully crafted digital experiences would stutter and crawl and obfuscate and perplex people and often ultimately fail. So right now I'm working with a company called Field Intelligence. We're a tech and design shop with a small, pretty lean, multidisciplinary team. So our office and most of our staff are in Abuja in Nigeria. And we're focusing on using design and tech and data to tackle some really gigantic problems. Really kind of blows your mind when you stop and think about it. Nigeria is a country of 180 million people, and many of them up in the north have some of the worst health and economic statistics in the world. And we try and do this as much as possible, not in WHO boardrooms in Geneva, but on the ground where the problems are, where the challenges are. And we test our products with people in large, small communities on their devices, on their connections. And we observe firsthand how they react to interfaces and how their devices handle them. So just as an example, we're working with government to improve vaccine availability in Nigeria. So millions of dollars worth of vaccines come into the country, hundreds of millions every year. But it's a really long process from getting those vaccines from the manufacturer warehouse in Copenhagen all the way through into like trucks and vans, through various levels of local government, trying to keep them at the right temperature and get them all the way out to the children that really need them most in these very rural northern Nigerian settlements. So it's made really, really challenging by these very unreliable power and connectivity issues, some really fragmented processes, and constant states of emergency. And the possibility of damage to these very, very heat-sensitive vaccines as they move through this system is pretty high. And we can't really begin to do anything about it without some really consolidated data on the process. So we're designing and building software that our users can use to track these vaccines, where they go, and so where we can predict where the demand for them is. So it's very hard to grasp the scale of these challenges when you're working in a European context. So I want to go through some of the ways that we've found of helping users, no matter what their background is, to interact in these complex systems by giving them simpler and more intuitive and guided ways of working. And I also want to just give you a good overview of what the conditions are really like, how like technology operates there, because it's not just about the interface. There's a lot of factors. So every place is different, of course, so I just want to add that caveat. What happens in Nigeria and other parts of West Africa is not exactly how it goes down in India. But I think this is a good place to start. So what's your typical tech user like in Africa? Of course, there isn't one. Is there a typical British tech user? Probably not. So I've encountered people across such a broad spectrum of education and resources and their level of comfort and tech savviness, using smartphones, using laptops, any kind of interface. And there are a lot of people who are like really skillful users of technology, a lot of hackers. They're really thriving tech scenes in a lot of cities. But we want to design for like a baseline experience here so that it's a more accessible kind of thing. The kind of devices that you see are generally on the cheaper and lower end spectrum. So they often look something like this. They have often very, very small screens. It's very hard to design for sometimes. And they're mostly Android, mostly always Android really, and often very cheap hardware. And a lot of people have a lot of phones actually. They kind of hack their signals and pull SIM cards here around to like make the best of their network connections. So the common brands that you have, Huawei, Lenovo, Techno, Motorola, LG, Samsung's getting up the top end of the market there, and Apple devices are very fancy. You see them around sometimes, but not that often. And a lot of people actually have multiple phones because if one dies, you can use the other. Or they have like an old Nokia non-smartphone, like a dumb phone, so that if their smartphone battery dies, probably some of you remember this, but these Nokia phones, their battery lasts for about a week. So you can still call and text people with those. And you get some real workhorses. You see a lot of scratched up screens, a lot of broken screens, very low resolution screens. A lot of people put glare protection films on them so that they're easier to use outside. And a lot of people put big rugged cases on them to protect them. So it means that they're really like a lot less tactile, a lot less responsive, and the screen quality can be really poor. And charging your phone in sub-Saharan Africa can be a real massive pain in the ass for a lot of people. I think everyone probably knows this feeling of panic that you have when you get a 10% or 5% battery warning. I mean, you can imagine seeing that when you know that you have to wait until maybe tomorrow morning to walk to your uncle's place 6 kilometers away and charge it on his generator. It's a bit more of an annoyance than it is here. So if you have a building in a community that has electricity, and this is in Guinea, in a health facility that was renovated and had solar panels. And every single PowerPoint in that place was taken up by someone's phone charging. So people would come there just to charge their phones. But even this is often very slow. A diesel generator like this one takes around 2 hours to charge a smartphone. And solar power takes even longer. It takes 4 to 5 hours sometimes to charge up a phone. And I see a lot of talks recently about performance and about how performance matters. And I think this is a place where it really, really does matter. Because if your app or your website is sucking up battery life or sucking up data for no really good reason, then it's not just an annoyance, like it took 6 seconds for this font to load. It means that you might have to go then walk for an hour just to charge your device. Connectivity is bad, as I said, generally. You can expect phones to be offline most of the time. So remote areas have very little cell coverage, and even in cities, the network coverage can be really, really bad. You hardly ever see Wi-Fi or cable connections around. And of course, buying mobile data is still really expensive for a lot of people compared to their incomes. So where possible, it's really, really important to try and build in some level of offline functionality to your app. So try and think about all the points where your product could fail without a network connection, or even with a battery that runs out, or a cracked screen that's hard to read. Try and build in these really graceful degradations. So Instagram, for example, it used to not really work at all if you're offline. And they've made big improvements on this. And now if you're offline, of course you can't update your feed, but you can still take a photo, you can edit it, put a filter on it, you can put a caption on it, and post it, and it will upload later when you're online, whenever you do have a connection. And the most recent photos in your bio and in your feed are cached, so you can still look at those. And the same goes for Facebook, for WhatsApp, for Spotify and Netflix, Gmail, all these kind of services. I think those companies and services are really realizing the importance of offline friendliness. So it allows you to keep using the services in some way when you're offline. Maybe adjusts the experience a bit, or the quality. In the case of Netflix, for example, it'll decrease the quality of your stream depending on what your connection's like. But even when you do have a connection, it can be so slow. And I know whoever's doing development, probably you test on Chrome, you limit your connection, you throttle it, you use an emulator or whatever, but it's really hard to imagine what it's like to use something on a connection that's like 50K downstream, 20K upstream, on top of a device that has pretty low memory and like 15 bubble games installed, so it's like barely operating. You really can't understand that kind of latency until you've experienced it. And that's even in a native app, not just web apps. So there are things that you can do to help your UI seem a bit snappier. So don't tie UI elements to long-running requests, network requests. Don't block navigation, and make your loading indicators like online rather than like blocking. So, I find this really annoying. Even in Berlin, if I go onto the underground and start up Spotify, I'll have like 2 bars of like shitty edge connection. And even though I have all this music saved to listen offline, because I have a little bit of connection, it'll try and load up the homepage with all this like what's hot in German pop, and like I can't click to my music. It's really, really annoying. Chrome, of course, is the default browser in Android, but Opera Mini is really, really huge in Africa. It's the lightest in terms of the system requirements and the data that it uses. So a lot of people use it. It's really good to make sure that it's part of your testing process. And people turn their phones off all the time. They'll buy a little bit of data to do something specific, turn it on, do their thing, and then turn it off again. So this saves their battery and it saves the data. So stuff like push notifications, background stuff, background refresh or sync, it can be really tricky. So you need to be really clever about how you do this and about how you use service workers and stuff. And a lot of people have only ever used touchscreen devices. So for one particular project, we trialed both a tablet version and a laptop version with like a USB stick for connection. So it was the same app. But the laptop version was really a bit of a failure. It was very confusing for someone who'd been introduced to interfaces via smartphones. So using a laptop where the input devices are separate from the screen was really, really, really slow. Most people have never had to touch type before. There was a lot of kind of like looking down and then looking up and then looking down and looking up. And it's also a lot heavier to like cart around and harder to charge it. And it's also actually, we've found that, like, I mean, I'm sure everyone here has done this. Like, if you have bad reception somewhere, you're like kind of walking around going, oh, I think it works here, I think it works here. And doing that with the laptop is not elegant. So maps are really not widely used or understood. Most of the drivers that we observed for a driver-based project had very little understanding of these, very little experience using maps to navigate. They relied on a very kind of intimate local knowledge of areas or a kind of communal knowledge, so they would ask other drivers how to get there. Novice users almost never really understand gestures to start with, so swiping, pulling down, pulling up, just very, very unintuitive. Buttons, people get that straight away. It's something that you can push. It's easy to understand. And people do learn gestures quite quickly, but you need to be careful about how you introduce them, and it's probably better as a shortcut rather than as the primary means to access something. If elements aren't on the visible area of the screen, then you might be in trouble. And I know this whole like people don't scroll thing is so 5 years ago. Probably thought that we'd moved on from it, but I'm bringing it back. But scrolling is actually a really unintuitive thing for a novice user. So long scrolling pages, off-canvas navigation, it's really, really hard to use. Especially if there are task-based things to do on a page rather than just text. So this is a pretty classic example of a form. You have to collect a bunch of data about a person, but we found that new users had a lot of trouble using this. They didn't realize that there's more stuff happening underneath here. And this doesn't even get started with stuff like form validation errors that maybe aren't in the visible area of the screen. So a good alternative that we found was to split this over several steps, so to use a more kind of wizard style of interface. So we broke things down to like one main action per screen, and this kind of kept everything in view and was very easily understood. I think avoiding concealed elements in general where you can, it's not always possible, of course, it's a good way to go. So select tags are kind of a classic example of this. And something that we often saw was when people had to put in like a hierarchy, a location hierarchy. And the most obvious way to do this, I guess, is select tags. So you choose your zone and your province, your town. But it was really, really confusing. All the information's hidden away. If you change your selection back at the start, then it resets everything that's subsequent to it. And a lot of people all over the world have trouble with select tags. I think they're notorious for this. I think gov.uk actually did a lot of good research on this as well. So this is the alternative that we used. It's like before, we split it over 3 different screens in the workflow. So we ask users where they are, we show them all the options, and we use very clear labeling to tell them how to choose something. Tap on the thing. And we use this to quite good effect in DRC on a mobile data collection project. So good affordance is very, very important. If something can be pressed, make it look like it can be pressed. These real-world metaphors really help users understand how to use your interface. So make buttons look, bigger and clickier and more obvious. If it's raised a little bit above a flat surface, then it suggests the idea of pressing in it. And language plays such an important part of an interface. So clearly labeling things is really important. And if you're using icons, you try and use them with labels, because the label explains something and the icon helps people remember it. So if you look at the difference here between these 2 buttons, we've become very conditioned to accept this one on the left as a button. Flat UIs have been around for quite a while now. But a lot of people haven't had this conditioning, and so to them, the button on the right is immediately much more clickable. And maybe you think it's uglier, but it doesn't really matter. And speaking of clicking, people will press on everything just to see what it does. And so particularly in a flat UI, everything looks like maybe it's a button. So they'll press everything until they find something that reacts. And this, it's important for your app to be really robust in this sense, because I've seen people, if it doesn't respond instantly, they'll tap it 15 times and then be like, what's happening? And if the screen hasn't changed, they'll switch to another app, switch back, and then log out, and then log back in again and tap it 10 more times. And it's pretty good QA, actually. And because of this, because people often just click on stuff to see what it does, it's a really good idea to build in confirmation dialogues for destructive actions. So offer warning steps if someone's going to delete something. Offer them a very clear path backwards. Animations can really help, and they can also really hinder someone's understanding of something. So use them really wisely, and especially for performance reasons as well. So when it comes to inputting data or just doing any kind of task, animations really, really get in the way. And this is a material UI thing that people, it's very common. I see this around. And also all sorts of cool focus animations on input. And it's really it's so confusing to someone trying to fill in these forms. It really in no way hints at what should happen when you complete the gesture, and it certainly doesn't, depict any movement in the natural world. I think we just do it because it's cool. Animations really shine when they illuminate a spatial model. It really helps users realize where they are, where they're going. Animating between screens makes it very obvious that they're going backwards or forwards through a workflow. And they can really help people learn how to use gestures. Let's play that again. So it's a very exaggerated movement there. So animating that element to the left really helps people understand how those gesture-based animations work. And make sure that you keep your navigation and UI elements very, very consistent, because it helps people learn and memorize the app. And this has very particular advantages for people who aren't very literate. They can learn how to use something just by memorizing how the patterns work. And don't be afraid to make it fun. Inserting a little bit of personality into your app really makes it really encourages people to use it, to keep at it. And gamification as well incentivizes people to stay with it, and it gives them really clear feedback if they're on the right path. So doing stuff like that, if a user completes an action successfully, we've had a lot of success with that. And if you're ever in doubt about what to do, steal from other like well-known apps. My legal department said that I should say borrow rather than steal. So there are certain apps that everyone, or almost everyone in Africa who has a smartphone uses. So Facebook, WhatsApp, Gmail. If you're in doubt, like look at the navigation patterns and the UI patterns that are in those apps and try and emulate them a little bit. So, I mean, nearly every health worker that I've worked with who was provided with a smartphone, it was their first smartphone, they eventually, or often immediately, proceeded to download Facebook, WhatsApp, and Gmail, and all the other Google things. Probably the best thing that we can do as designers or as developers is to get your hands on the slowest, shittiest, like secondhand, scratched up Android device that you can find. And so maybe like load as many games onto it as you can, maybe drop it on the ground and kick it around a bit, and then buy 200 megabytes of data on like the worst network available, run the battery down a bit, and then go out of the city into the woods somewhere where you're not going to have a very good connection. And really like see how your app, your website performs under those conditions. I think it would be very, very illuminating. And I just want to emphasize again that what I just described is not the universal experience in emerging markets. They're big and diverse countries. There's a lot of people there. They have vastly different levels of resources and education and experience. But I always just want to keep thinking about this baseline, thinking about having the widest reach, and just thinking about being more fair and more egalitarian about how people can access our stuff. And if you do want to bring your product to an emerging market, I would strongly encourage you to engage with like the local tech ecosystem. So you can collect insights right at the base level and engage them in a way that is really meaningful, like in strategy and in policy, rather than just as kind of part of a validation process. There are a lot of like really talented men and women in Africa and other parts of the developing world. They're really like shaping the future of technology there and globally as well. So wrapping up here, I just want to encourage you to be curious about the digital landscapes beyond your own, and to have empathy for the people working in those landscapes, but to also like do the research, do the work there. I think accessibility often sounds like maybe it's a bit boring or it's extra work, but it's actually really, really fascinating to see how people operate in the world and beyond our borders. I mean, I found that African tech consumers, just like those across the world, are very demanding and informed once they become familiar with this technology. And despite being relative newcomers, they want the same kind of clear, reliable, smooth-running mobile solutions than we do here. And the things that matter to technology consumers here, they matter to people in Africa, to other parts of the developing world. And they just have to be way more creative about how they access it. So they want to communicate, they want to connect with people, they want to be informed, they want to have greater economic opportunities. They want to listen to music, they want to be entertained, they want to take photos. I've never taken so many group selfies as when I've been in Africa. And I think these resource-constrained environments, they've taught me a lot as a designer, as a developer. They can teach us a lot in general. You really need to strip everything back to the essentials. You really need to do the work to get to know your users, not just rely on a sense of empathy. And you want to make things that are useful to them, not just to what you think is useful to you and people like you. And it's really taught me about resourcefulness. So the capacity of people in these low resource environments to hack stuff, to make it work for them, it always astounds me. So a colleague of mine posted this when he was working in Namibia. So it's a couple of kids have procured a donkey and a trailer and a stick to get their hustle on and go do whatever they needed to do. And it's a really different mindset from what you see here, which is like, this doesn't work for 4 seconds, I'm going to throw it away. And like another example of this kind of hustle is, we're working on a project now to get informal transport workers, so like drivers who are often very underemployed, to get them to deliver health commodities like pharmaceuticals and vaccines. So this really fills a gap in health logistics, but it also gives these drivers a lot of opportunity in terms of financial opportunities and upskilling. And when we initially went to this big driver park to approach some drivers about being part of a pilot program, the requirement was that they have a smartphone, and a lot of them didn't. But so many of those people who didn't have them, it was astounding how quickly they managed to get their hands on one, like within a couple of hours sometimes. So they really had the incentive to do that. And once they had them, it was amazing how quickly they self-taught themselves how to do it. Often it was a case of brute forcing their way through something, but they really made it work for them. And I think if we can tap into that ingenuity, then we and them and all of us in this global tech community can build some really powerful stuff. We need to be really curious about the world beyond our limited borders. So I don't think you have to go to Guinea or to Nigeria or the Congo or anywhere else to discover this or for it to be useful to you. Because I think everyone really benefits from this kind of learning, from reduced complexity, from having like offline capable apps, from having very performant websites. And these are problems everywhere. And I think the context is just really, really exacerbated here. And we're all just human. So the next billion, it's really not about a number. It's not about a particular place. And I don't think it's a step backwards. I think it's a metaphor or an idea about the future of the internet that's going to be really shaped in a large part by this explosion of connectivity in the developing world. And I think that's something that we can all be excited to play a small part in. So thank you. This has been a very, very broad overview. If you have questions or want to talk about more stuff, please feel free to grab me later, and I'm happy to talk about that.